My name is Lin Fan, and I have been dying slowly for 3 years. Not quickly, not dramatically, just the slow, ordinary death of someone who cannot eat enough, cannot pay enough, cannot hold on quite long enough. Blackstone City does this to people. It grinds them down the way stone grinds grain, patiently and without malice, until there's nothing left but powder. I stood in the crowded market with hard bread I couldn't sell, watching the stall feet deadline approach like a wall. If I missed it, the guards would remove me from the city the way you'd remove spoiled food from a kitchen, quickly, without sentiment, past the walls where the monsters wait. Back in Hasha, the city in China where I grew up, people complained about rent and traffic and the price of groceries. I used to complain with them. Now I would give anything for those problems. I hadn't eaten in 2 days. The other merchants had a name for me, the Void Transporter. They said it with the particular warmth people reserve for failures they find entertaining. A year ago, I discovered I had a talent, a magical ability to move objects. In this world, that should have meant something. Every time I tried to use it, I focused on an object, pushed with whatever part of the mind controls such things, and watched it disappear into darkness. Gone. Irretrievable. I tested it with bread, with cloth, with nails I'd collected from the street. Everything vanished and nothing came back. I'd spent my savings on the testing and earned nothing but the name. Then the sky opened. Golden light split the clouds above Blackstone City, and a voice entered every mind in the market simultaneously. The kind of voice that doesn't need ears, that simply arrives fully formed in your consciousness. A goddess, vast and certain, announcing that the gods had found a new world. Fertile, abundant, ready for conquest. They would lead the divine realm's people to take it within 10 years. The crowd cheered. People wept with relief. A star map materialized in the sky, enormous and detailed, and I looked up at it the way everyone looked up at it, until I found the edge of the map, and my heart simply stopped. A small blue planet. White clouds and slow spiral patterns. Continents I had traced with my finger on paper maps in elementary school. The gods intended to invade Earth. And in the moment I understood that, something else happened. Every object I had ever sent into the void lit up in my mind like a signal flare. The bread, the cloth, the nails. I could see them scattered across my homeland, glowing like markers on an invisible map. They hadn't disappeared. They'd gone home. My broken, useless gift was a bridge between worlds, and I was the only person in either world who knew what was coming. I ran back to my collapsing house in the slums and sat on the floor, trying to breathe normally. If the items had truly gone to Earth, I could retrieve them. I closed my eyes and reached for the oldest marker, a small clay pot I'd lost in my first month here, and pulled. It appeared in front of me with a sound like a cork releasing, smelling of damp soil, and the particular freshness of rain on concrete. The smell of home. I sat with that pot for a long time. Then I stopped crying and started thinking. The weight limit I'd always felt pressing against my talent resolved into a specific number, 500 grams. Once every 3 days. Small. Insufficient for any dramatic intervention. But enough, if used carefully, to survive. And more than enough to send a warning. I needed to contact my mother. I wrote the letter as clearly as I could, which I knew wouldn't be very clear. Magic and gods and invasion timelines and parallel worlds, read by someone who last saw me 3 years ago and has probably spent those years imagining scenarios, none of which involved any of this. I kept to the practical. I'm alive. I'm in another world. The situation is serious. Please fill the enclosed bag with exactly 490 grams of fine white flour and leave it where you found it. I placed the letter in a small animal hide pouch, weighted it, and focused everything I had on the coordinates of my apartment in Hasha. Blue light. The package was gone. Then I waited 3 days. My mother, Le Xiaolon, had not been well. 3 years of searching for a son who vanished without explanation does certain things to a person. She had spent her savings, damaged her health, and arrived at the particular exhaustion that comes from hoping too long against too much evidence. She had considered, over those years, every possibility she could construct: accident, kidnapping, trafficking, a crime compound across the border where people were held and used. She had filed reports. She had made calls. Nothing. She came home to find a strange dark pouch sitting on her coffee table. It was the material that stopped her immediately. Something membrane-like, organic in a way that no fabric she'd ever touched was organic. The smell was wrong. Not spoiled, just fundamentally alien, like something that had never been meant to exist in her city, her apartment, her world. Inside was a letter in her son's handwriting. She read it twice. Then she sat down. Then she read it a third time. My mother is a practical woman. She did not consider magic or dimensional travel or gods. She considered what she knew. Her son had vanished. She'd always feared something criminal was involved, and now she had received a letter from him that spoke in coded, oblique language about other worlds and gods, and a request for flour. The bag was clearly a device of some kind, a delivery mechanism, smuggling technology. Flour in coded criminal communication means one thing. She was terrified. She was also, finally, in possession of evidence. She called the police. Officer Jiang Wei was young enough to still approach unusual cases with more curiosity than habit. He expected, arriving at my mother's apartment, to find the beginning of a standard trafficking investigation. What he found instead was a piece of paper made from plant fibers that matched nothing in any global database, and a bag composed of biological material whose DNA matched no known life form on Earth. Not mammal, not bird, not insect, not bacteria. He stopped thinking about trafficking. The case moved upward through the system with the particular velocity of things that genuinely frighten people. Director Zhao Jianyang at the Provincial Security Department sent samples to Professor Liu Jingwu, whose laboratory was equipped for the kind of analysis that answers questions nobody wants to ask. The answer, when it came, was 3 interlocked helical strands. Double helix DNA is the architecture of all life on Earth, from viruses to humans, without exception. What Professor Liu found in my letter's paper and my mother's strange bag had 3. A stable, natural triple helix, elegant and completely impossible, built from the same materials as Earth life, and utterly unlike it in the most fundamental structural sense. He called Director Zhao. His opening sentence was not a greeting. This is no longer a police matter. Minister Wang Chun had been in his current position long enough to have seen most of the ways the world could surprise a careful man. He read the report alone in his office for nearly 2 hours. Triple helix DNA. Unknown stable elements not found on any periodic table. A letter claiming to be from another world, describing a planned invasion, written by a Chinese citizen. He called academician Qin Heping at the Institute of Biophysics and drove to him personally, arriving with a metal case carrying the samples and the conviction of someone who has already accepted a fact and is simply confirming its dimensions. The laboratory analysis that followed was the most disorienting scientific event in Chinese history, conducted in near silence by researchers who had dedicated their lives to understanding life as it exists on Earth and were now confronting evidence that it existed differently elsewhere. Unknown elements. A genetic architecture with no terrestrial precedent. A biological structure that was not alien in the science fiction sense. Not metallic, not crystalline, not incomprehensible, but organic and natural and simply operating under rules that Earth biology had never found necessary to develop. When academician Qin came to the observation window to get Wang Chun, his eyes held the particular expression of someone who has broken something irreplaceable and cannot decide whether to feel grief or wonder. Minister Wang, please come in. There is something you need to see for yourself. At 3 a.m, in a conference room built to survive nuclear strikes, the people responsible for China's national security sat around a table and looked at data that rewrote everything they understood about their situation in the world. Academician Qin presented the triple helix. He presented the spectroscopic analysis showing elements that had never been named because they'd never been found. He presented his conclusion in a voice that was steady because steadiness was required, not because he felt it. Wang Chun stood afterward and summarized. Another world existed. It possessed a power system called magic, likely based on physical laws that produced those unknown elements. That world was in decline. Its gods had identified Earth as a target for resource extraction and conquest. The timeline was 10 years, and one Chinese citizen, alone, somewhere in that world, surviving on minimal resources, was the only source of intelligence they had and the only channel of contact they could establish. Someone asked the obvious question. The letter described two-way transmission. Could they verify it? They could. They prepared 490 grams of astronaut-grade high-gluten flour, added a single gram of nanomaterial paper bearing two sentences. Comrade Lin Fan, the nation believes in you. Hasha will always be your strongest support. Weighed everything precisely, placed it in the return pouch, and put it inside a vacuum chamber surrounded by every sensor they had. When the scheduled window arrived, the bag disappeared. No flash, no energy signature, no detectable physical disturbance of any kind. It was present in one frame of high-speed footage and absent in the next, as completely and quietly as if it had never existed. In the conference room, a general who had served through 3 decades of genuine crises clenched his fists on the table. The Supreme Command for Interdimensional Strategy was established that night. Wang Chun was named its chief commander. Their mission was specific: support one person through a channel that opened once every 3 days and could carry no more than 500 grams, until that person could change the outcome of a war that hadn't started yet. I had been counting down the hours. When the cycle ended, I sat cross-legged on my floor and reached for the coordinates of the pouch. They had shifted, moved from my apartment to somewhere else, somewhere institutional and distant. Something had gone wrong, or more likely, something had gone very right in a way I hadn't anticipated. I retrieved the bag. It was heavier than I'd sent it. When I opened it, the smell of wheat hit me so cleanly and completely that I had to press my fist against my mouth to keep from making sound. Not the dusty, rough grain smell of Blackstone City's coarse flour. The real thing, refined past anything I'd seen, even on Earth. Hidden in the flour was a sheet of material thinner than any paper I'd touched, weightless, bearing printed characters. Comrade Lin Fan, the nation believes in you. Hasha will always be your strongest support. The word comrade, that particular word. I sat on the floor of my broken house and felt 3 years of accumulated weight move through me all at once. The hunger, the humiliation, the loneliness, the specific despair of fighting alone in a world that considers you a joke, and I understood that I was no longer alone. Behind me stood 1.4 billion people and the full institutional machinery of the country that made me, aimed at the problem I had identified. I let myself feel that for as long as I could afford to. Then I wrapped most of the flour in cloth and hid it under the floorboards, kept a portion in my pocket, and walked to the best bakery in Blackstone City. The Golden Wheat Aroma Bakery was staffed by a young worker whose first instinct, seeing my clothes, was to block the door with his arm. I walked past him. He followed, shouting. The customers in line turned to watch. I set my cloth bundle on the dark wooden counter and unwrapped it. The flour caught the light in a way that ordinary flour doesn't. Purely white, impossibly fine, no variation in color or texture, luminous against the gray and brown of everything surrounding it. The room went quiet in the way rooms do when something enters that doesn't belong to them. From the back kitchen came the owner. Glur was a substantial man who had spent 30 years handling flour, which meant he understood it the way surgeons understand tissue. Intimately, technically, with an instinct that went past conscious analysis. He crossed to the counter, pushed his worker aside, and reached out with fingers that still had traces of his morning work under the nails. He pinched a small amount, held it to the light, put it in his mouth. I watched his face change. He offered me 60 copper coins. I began putting the flour back in the cloth. He offered more. I kept packing. He grabbed my hand. I told him 1 silver coin. What followed was a brief, excruciating negotiation in which Glur's certainty that he was being robbed competed directly with his certainty that he was holding the most valuable baking ingredient he had ever encountered. The certainty about the ingredient one. He counted out 100 copper coins with the expression of a man amputating his own limb. I took the coins to the patrol station and paid Barton a month's lodging without counting the coins individually, which I had never been able to do before. Then I went home. What Glur did with that flour was not something I anticipated. He sent his apprentices out of the kitchen and locked the door. He washed his hands 3 times. He handled the dough the way someone handles something sacred, and discovered it handled back, elastic and alive in a way that 30 years of experience hadn't prepared him for, as if the flour had opinions about how it wanted to be worked. 10 loaves went into the oven. What came out was, by any reasonable standard, not bread. It was something that used the form of bread to contain a quantity of sensory information that the local population had never been assembled in a single baked item. The smell alone left the kitchen, crossed the market, and stopped conversations happening 50 meters away. People put down their work. They turned toward it without deciding to. They followed it to the source. Glur carried his tray to the door and announced 30 copper coins per loaf to a crowd that had gathered without knowing why. The mockery lasted about 40 seconds, until the steward of Viscount Du Bois pushed through the crowd, set a silver coin on the counter, and said he wanted 3. Viscount Du Bois, in the privacy of his residence, ate the bread his steward brought him and underwent a personal transformation. He was a man who took genuine pride in his appreciation for fine things, who drank imported wine from the capital to remind himself and others of his status. And what he experienced eating that bread was the specific humiliation of discovering that everything he'd previously considered excellent was approximate. He sent his butler back for more. The bakery had sold out. He arrived himself with guards, lifted Glur off the ground by his collar, and explained that 10 loaves would be ready the following morning or the consequences would be architectural and personal. Glur, still trembling, came to my door that night with fruit and cheap beer and the manner of a man who has just understood how thoroughly he has miscalculated his position. I told him I had no more flour. I watched the hope leave his face and waited while he cycled through the stages of a man who has found a golden goose and is now being informed it was temporary. When he reached the stage where he was willing to offer me anything, I told him my condition. 50% of all profits from bread made with my flour, enforced by a magic contract witnessed by the god of justice. He signed it while trying not to cry. The arrangement worked beyond what either of us projected. I became, invisibly, the controlling interest in what rapidly became Blackstone City's most prestigious bakery. The Hope White Bread, 15 loaves per day, 1 silver coin each, was within weeks a social currency among the city's upper class. Noble stewards waited in lines before dawn. Merchants sent gifts to Glur hoping for priority access. I collected 50% and thought about larger problems. The flour kept arriving from home every 72 hours, alongside increasingly sophisticated supplies, concentrated nutrition bars, alloy tools, antibiotics, water purification tablets. In return, I sent soil samples, water samples, biological specimens, pressed plants, a dried 6-legged creature that I found behind my stone house and that I suspected would cause significant excitement in whatever laboratory received it. On the 10th cycle, the package included something different. But before that package arrived, I had sent back a fireball scroll. I bought it in a damp underground market that smelled of cheap alcohol and unresolved crimes, from a one-eared man whose expression suggested he had seen everything and been impressed by none of it. 30 silver coins, which was most of a week's income, for a piece of animal hide covered in symbols I couldn't read and patterns I couldn't interpret. I tried for a week to make sense of it and produced nothing but headaches. I sent it home along with a low-grade magic crystal about the size of a fingernail, a universal language dictionary written for noble children, a bard's history of the dying continent, and an adventurer's survival manual. In my accompanying letter, I explained what each was and what I hoped the research teams could do with it. Then I waited for the 10th cycle. The package that arrived contained a booklet, a device that resembled an ordinary athletic earpiece, and a letter from Minister Wang Chen. I read about the triple helix, about the unknown elements, about the emergency committee convened in a nuclear-hardened basement, about 50 of the country's foremost specialists being gathered from universities and research institutes in the middle of the night by people who showed credentials and said the nation needs you without explaining further. I read about a young linguist named Suching who was also an electrical engineer, who stared at the magic circuit pattern until she saw it as a schematic and renamed the magic diagram the magic circuit at 2 in the morning while the supercomputer ran its billion simulations. I read about an old Taoist master named Jiangqing Xian, who had spent decades practicing techniques that his granddaughter, Suching herself, had spent equal time trying to prove were superstition, and how those techniques and that science had collided in a basement laboratory and been discovered to be describing the same phenomenon from different directions. I read about a young soldier with no magical background and no relevant training who, after 24 hours using the feedback device, stood in an isolation chamber, closed his eyes, opened them, extended his hand, and produced a small, steady fireball. I held the training booklet, Standard Non-Casting Practice Manual, Fireball Technique, First Edition. One's own country is truly powerful. The thought arrived without irony or qualification, simply as a fact. I put on the earpiece, held a magic crystal, closed my eyes. The manual didn't describe the process in mystical language. It described it in the language of visualization and neural synchronization and feedback loops. When my mental image of the circuit diagram sharpened, the earpiece played piano music. When I lost focus, it returned to static. The training reduced an ancient mystery to the experience of a very demanding video game, played entirely inside one's own mind. 8 hours later, I heard something click. I opened my eyes, focused on a clay cup across the room, and released the mental image as the manual described. A fireball formed in my palm, bright and hot and real, and crossed the room and hit the cup, which softened, then flowed, then cooled into a small puddle of former ceramic on the rough floor. I stood there for a while, looking at it. Then I started making plans. The plans required leaving Blackstone City. The Magic Academy was in Silver Moon City, more than 100 kilometers of wasteland, monster territory, and cracked earth away. A merchant like me couldn't get there alone. I needed guards. I went to the Adventurers Guild the following morning and posted a job. One night outside the city walls as protective escort, 10 silver coins. The board received my posting with general amusement. People glanced at it and moved on. Then a voice cut through the noise. I'll take it. Her name was Ella. She was maybe 22, with leather armor that fit properly and a long sword that she wore like it belonged to her rather than to the image of herself she was trying to project. She had graduated from the Warrior Academy as an elite fighter, she said, and she knew the terrain outside Blackstone City. She said this with the confidence of someone who is mostly telling the truth. We went out that night. Within the first exchange, she watched me cast a fireball without speaking any spell. I watched her watch me, saw her try to reconcile what she'd observed with everything she'd been taught about magic, and made a rapid decision. I lowered my voice, produced a subtle vibration from deep in my throat, barely audible, lips closed, and explained that I used a special throat technique. She accepted this with the expression of someone who has been briefly frightened and is now mostly annoyed. We fought through the night, progressively deeper into the wasteland. Ella was extraordinary, precise, and completely without hesitation, her sword moving through sequences that looked less like individual strikes than like a single continuous motion. I was terrible. My first several fireballs missed cleanly, striking dead trees and empty ground, startling zombies without harming them. I improved. By the 4th hour, with Ella holding the line and me providing what she generously called covering fire, we had accumulated 53 magic cores from ghoul corpses and killed the last surviving members of 3 separate groups that had come looking for a fight. We rested in a cave before dawn. I counted the cores, calculated the costs, realized I'd spent 5 silver coins on crystals to earn 10 silver coins in cores while risking my life continuously for several hours, and wrote monster hunting off my list of income strategies. But I had confirmed something more important. The training worked. The fireball was real. I was no longer a merchant with a broken talent. I was a mage, novice and imprecise, but genuine, with the full backing of China's scientific establishment behind the methodology that made me. I needed the academy. I needed a way to get there. I talked to Ella about costs. She was honest, reliable guards, supplies, and the particular category of supply she called bait People purchased from the slave market for the specific purpose of attracting monster attention and buying the main party time to escape. The word disposable was used without hesitation. I sat with that for a while. The slave market's clearance section was at the back of the main market, past the iron cages holding orc warriors and elves with collapsed posture, through a narrow corridor that smelled of sewage and something organic and wrong. The trader boss who led me back there had adjusted his manner upon learning I could pay, which is a specific kind of transaction I had experienced from the other side and found no easier to observe from this one. In a small, rusted cage in the farthest corner, 5 girls from the cat-eared tribe were packed together. They were thin in the way that goes past appearance and physiology, bodies that had been using stored reserves for some time. Their wounds showed infection. 2 had fevers. The oldest was perhaps 17. Their eyes held nothing. Not despair, not anger. Just absence, like windows in an abandoned building. 10 silver coins for all 5. I paid it. I'm not going to pretend this decision was uncomplicated. I had been these girls, not in their species or their precise circumstances, but in the essential fact of it. Powerless in a system that had no interest in my survival, spending my energy on each next day rather than any future. The man counting coins and making practical calculations about the per-unit cost of a human life. I had been on the other side of that calculation, and I remembered exactly what it felt like. I also carry the weight of 1.4 billion people who would have no future if I failed. This is not a resolution. There's no clean logic that makes it right. There's only the fact that I paid the coins, took the key that controlled the collars around their necks, and walked them out of the market toward the city gate. Ella assessed them with a professional's eye and said they were too thin to run far, but adequate for the purpose. I said nothing. On the first night outside the city, one of the girls, Lily, the youngest, barely 14, collapsed. The infection in her leg wound had progressed past the point where she could stand. Her fever was critical. One of my hired warriors looked at her for about 3 seconds and said she was beyond saving and should be left. He was correct by the standards of this world's medical knowledge. I have antibiotics from Earth. 100 doses sent by people who understood that in a world with no germ theory and no penicillin, this was perhaps the most asymmetric advantage I could carry. I have been careful with them. I have been thinking about them in terms of strategic value and long-term positioning. I retrieved 5 doses from a box in the wagon. The oldest girl, Mia, saw me approaching Lily with a syringe and screamed. She lunged at me with what strength she had left, which was more than I'd expected. The collar responded, tightening until her face changed color and she couldn't breathe. I reduced the pressure when she stopped struggling. She knelt on the ground, gasping while I continued. I injected all 5 of them, including her. I told them what had happened was not to be described or discussed, which the collars would enforce. Then I went back to the campfire. Mia thought I was conducting experiments on a dying girl to protect a 2 silver coin investment. She thought I was the worst category of person in a world that offered considerable competition for that category. She lay down expecting to die, hoping it would be soon and quiet. She woke before dawn. The fever was gone. Lily's face had returned to its normal color. The wound that had been suppurating and spreading had begun to close, its edges clean in a way that should have taken weeks. Mia reached out and touched Lily's forehead and felt cool skin. Her own body felt different, lighter, cleaner, as if something that had been accumulating inside her for months had been flushed out overnight. She looked at her own wounds and found them healing in the same impossible way. She tried to speak to her companions about what had happened, and the collar tightened immediately. She stopped. She understood. She lay there in the dark, watching the crimson moon set and the sky pale toward dawn, and thought about the man who had bought her as a tool and then used a medicine she couldn't name to save the life of the tool he considered most expendable. She didn't understand it. She also didn't understand why that incomprehension felt, for the first time in a very long time, like something worth being confused about. The wagon wheels began their morning creak. The camp broke down around them. The journey to Silver Moon City continued. Somewhere ahead, past cracked earth and dead trees, and the particular silence of a world in decline, there was a magic academy. There is a system to enter and a game to learn to play, and eventually a war to prevent.